Awesome. Yeah, well, thank you all so much for joining. I was truly honored to get to ask to speak. Manon will be here in the chat to sort of like gather up questions. I purposely saved like 10 to 15 minutes at the end, depending on how long-winded I get, so that we can do some Q&A, because I definitely want to hear sort of questions, but also sort of like, questions in relation to what was in the content. So definitely keep those in the chat. Yeah, so I'm here to talk about insider risk actualization, and we had a great mention from Olivier, but just right before the call got recorded, I was like, "Oh, is this going to be Splunk specific?" And yes, well, I will talk about things we do at Splunk to like execute on this type of strategy. But I really tried to make it a little bit agnostic about like how we do insider risk and generally how I guide people towards doing insider risk. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. So legal, 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 business, business, business. It's all right there if you'd like to check. But yeah, this is me. My name's Haley Mills. I'm a staff security strategist here over at Splunk. Been here about 3.5 years, but that was sort of my life pathway, was drawing cartoons and not getting paid enough to live and working 80-hour weeks. And then SOC analyst, tired of working the same alerts over and over and over again. And then became a security content engineer, realized how difficult it was to make decent alerts that didn't alert over and over and over again. Then I figured out some cool stuff with Splunk as a customer. We'll talk a little bit about risk-based alerting in a little bit, but I think it's pretty helpful and essential for this type of use case. And now I'm an engineer who makes PowerPoints. That's what a strategist means, apparently. So yeah, I'm here with a PowerPoint that I've made, but I still do engineering here and there. I'm doing lots of cool stuff on the side as well within Splunk that I'm excited about. But today I'm excited about insider risk. So I usually, and it sounds like there's a little background noise. So usually when I go into a customer, I'm sort of looking at three pieces of their general maturity around insider risk. It's really like data is at the core. We need data to look at because the data is what helps us drive detections, which, are like bringing us things to look at. And then when we look at them, how do we look at them with investigations? So first of all, we need to be able to access that data. Then ideally, we have detection content that like intelligently aggregates and sort of brings things forward. And then investigations is where we sort of dig into the data and utilize that access to generate insight of whether this is a true positive and potential insider risk activity, or we also want information that tells us this might be our null hypothesis might be true, that this isn't a problem. So we'll talk a little bit about how we do that. So something that a coworker really helped me with at my last job, my lead was really, really good about executing on this Pareto principle of doing the 20% of effort that gets 80% of results. And why this was helpful for me was because, I want to, as an engineer, I want to make things perfect. I want to make it execute just right. And the issue becomes the pace of development can get slowed down pretty significantly. And if you are sort of phasing your development, like, okay, for phase one, let's do the 20%, because we're going to get huge 80% results out of that initial 20% investment. So if we do phases on different sections of what we need to work on, whether that's data detections or investigations, we can really make an insider risk program spring into being a lot quicker. So I generally recommend people to phase their development and then switch contexts when it makes sense. So for example, if you did a sort of like data inventory of like, and sort of operational inventory of what you had per data source, and you're like, okay, with EDR, we definitely have the data. We have the enrichment. It's super, if we want to look at it, it's there and we can find it. But maybe we're not surfacing many things from our detection. So right there, it's like, I could put 20% of effort there, get 80% of that bar filled. And then maybe I could go to investigation. So we make things a little bit snappier when we need to look at that data. We can, jump into it a lot faster and get insight out of it. So I like doing this sort of exercise with a customer and sort of getting an idea in which data source do they have, some effort invested at all, because the ones where they have no data, you can't really do anything with no data. Then those are often like, well, let's get those online first and get some investment there, because that's going to sort of flesh out our program and flesh out the signal we generate from multiple places in our environment to like properly execute defense in depth. So usually what I do as a strategist when I come in is that I'm asking questions, and mainly starting with data, because I need the data to sort of help them make sense of their data. So often one of the first things I'm asking is, what data have you used in the past? Like if you're currently doing some level of insider risk, what has been involved in those incidents? What has been the investigation pathways? What were those, like what data sources were those investigations needing to look at? Because, usually people are already doing something, but it either like stops and starts, like the lead left or the manager left. So then we needed to hire someone. And so that there's a lot of times where, development doesn't increase over time. It sort of stalls a few times. So that's often where I'm brought in. So this can just sort of help us fill out that picture that I was talking about previously, and just get an idea of like, what maybe we already have access to and that sort of thing. Then I would love to know if there are actual detections on this data. A lot of times they have maybe one detection stream, even though they have like 4 or 5 data sources that they actually look at for investigations, but they only have detections coming from one source. And oftentimes that's a DLP system, which I love DLP systems, but they are very, very noisy. So like sometimes they have a detection from one pathway, but they look in a bunch of other places. So knowing if they have, detections in all of these places can be really helpful as well. And then just thinking about, for each step of that process, for the access to the data, for the like operational detections on that data, and then the response on that data with the insight in the sort of investigation pathway, how automated is any of that? Like when the investigation talks about like, I did this, was it like surfaced for them, or was it like they, crawled around, or they pulled events from PowerShell via PowerShell or something? Any step of that has some potential to make faster is just going to, overall make the insider risk program operate a lot more frictionless. So for insider risk, one thing I really like is that for detections for insider risk, it isn't quite as expansive as like malicious compromise. So in malicious compromise, we're like, literally all logs are relevant. I could find something security relevant in every data source ever, which is kind of overwhelming. And, it's the reason we have thousands of detections at some point for malicious compromise. But the nice thing about insider risk is that it's relatively well scoped to like this type of activity. And so I've got a few of my favorites listed there. I've seen mature insider risk programs that are like executing and finding insiders regularly with just 2 or 3 of those. Like you don't necessarily need all of them. But I think that these sources are generally the sources that you're going to use. And I highlighted 2 there because HR databases, I'll talk about in a little bit, but I just feel is so important for getting identity data about like, who is the user I'm investigating? Because that is like macro level context that like informs your entire investigation, because someone in like brand and creative might be sharing assets over the cloud and like sending external sharing requests to people outside your organization. So like the identity data, to me, just knowing who the user is one of the most important pieces to have to frame the entire investigation. And then I also highlighted cloud storage and access, because when like for example, I am logged in on my personal computer to like have access to my work Google Drive, and so that is a huge attack surface for potential insider risk content, because they could just upload it from their work laptop that they got through, you have protections in your whole work environment, and they download it to their work laptop, put into their Google Drive or whatever, and then they go on their personal device. They can bring their own device, log into cloud, and then they can download it to their personal machine. So like that is immediately one of the biggest attack surfaces if you have, bring your own device or that style of thing. And obviously, we want the business to be able to operate efficiently, which is often needed. Like I get my whole streaming set up on my personal computer, which is really nice, and I like doing presentations here. But it is just I highlight it because it is one of the most important things to get up and running if you have it. And the logs there are generally pretty good for like G Drive and O365 SharePoint kind of things. And then for data that you don't have, I think it's good to ask, well, do you know who owns it? And then if they own it and they have it, do they already process this data in any way? Because you might not necessarily need the raw data source. They may have it in like a pre-processed state that would be even more beneficial to utilize or just easier to utilize. It might be able to, you might be able to get that data into your SIM or, whatever you're utilizing to aggregate this type of data. That might be more beneficial and easier to use. And I ask, are you friends? Like in a kind of like silly tongue-in-cheek way, but I truly think it's worth asking if you could become friends. And the reason I say this is I think it's just important to be friendly, but also I read a book by Todd Barnum. He has on O'Reilly. He's the CISO of GoPro, has been for a long time, and he wrote this great book called The Enterprise or the Cybersecurity Manager's Guide. And he was talking about like how security is involved in literally every aspect of the business. So you touch all these places, but like when you touch a silo that you never talk to, and you come in with like, hey, security needs this, and you're like just directly asking for something. Nobody, like, I'm sure as security people, like when someone comes with a lateral ask and you've already got a zillion requests and things you need to do on your plate from your vertical, as well as various lateral asks you've already been involved in and are responsible for. If someone comes in with an ask and is like, hey, give me this, like that's one of the least of your priorities. So I like to think about, making friends at work because, if you have an idea of what would be on that team's radar, the types of like use cases they are solving, and you come to them with like, hey, I have security visibility, which is a lot. Like I have access to so many things. What do you need in your operations that would help you? And then could we work on like getting this data as well? And I did this at my last job, made a lot of friends, got and the nice thing about this was then we had a huge like an army of operational insight, because if we needed something from IAM, we've got friends in IAM who could clear up access questions during an incident. We just had so many people we knew that it was just really a lot easier to get data from them because we also delivered data to them in various ways. So I think it's just really important to make friends for security. So one thing that I really try to ensure people have when they have data is for detection specifically, to make that data work for you, can you attribute, when you have a log source that only has host name or IP, can you attribute that to a user in every single data source? Because if you can't, then you're like, with detections, you want to sort of like have signal generate. But if you don't have the user being attributed to those systems or IPs, you're not generating signal for your detection framework. So I generally say that, best guess approaches as a temporary measure are better than nothing. Something that I did as a customer, and I often see as a viable pathway for this, is like if IP plus user exists on any log source, use that as like generate some like lookup that gets brought into enrichment for your log sources for detections. A really common one is VPN logs, because you get like the assignment of the internal IP to a username. And now in your system and IP logs that only have IP or system, now you can be like, well, this search only runs every 10 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour that like generates the lookup that enriches things. But you would rather have that 95% of the time correct attribution to that user so it can surface, because you can sort it out at the tail end if you need to, if it wasn't accurate and when you investigate it. But it is just so helpful because some of those log sources are great content for detection, but if they aren't playing nicely with attributing to a user context, then you're missing out on that visibility. And I think that's really cool. The vice versa of that, which I think is less important, but for investigations, can you attribute user to system or IP in every data source? Because now when you're investigating, you're trying to look back and see what they did on each of one of their devices that's related to them. So that system and IP activity is really helpful when you're investigating, because you could also, find, additional devices that you weren't detecting on, or like you get a lot more context when you're looking backwards that way. So, it's not as, in my opinion, as necessary as make sure that user is attributed to system or IP for detections, but I think is also very handy to have. And then finally, now we've got a lot more idea about the data, but like, what are we making? Like, what is the end product? And who is the audience? And these all tied together here at the end, but it's like we want to make sure that whatever it is that we're building is actually being utilized, and also that it's doing whatever our end user actually wants. So, at the very beginning, I asked, like, what data have you been using for investigations? Like, who are those investigators? They will probably have some of the juiciest feedback about like what you need to build, or what needs doing. Obviously, teams change, and processes change, and the business evolves, and your operation evolves. But getting that idea can help with this last piece is, can they understand what you've built? Because I have helped a customer where like we got a great, a strategy session, and then a month later it seemed like everything was, rock solid. And then, their engineer built something actually really cool. Like I immediately understood it because we just had, a month of conversation about it. But when the end user got it, they didn't really know what was going on. And also it wasn't terribly, the UX UI of it was a little, janky. So like when they saw it, they were just sort of like, I don't even know what to use this for. So it wasn't helping as much as it could have. We did get them on the right track, but I think it's just worth thinking about this towards the beginning. So now finally moving to detections, which is one of my favorite parts. I mean, like I said, I was a content engineer, so I was crafting detections for, years, and I love doing this stuff. So what do we need for detections? I mentioned how important it is to have those HR databases, mainly because I think it is just kind of a must-have for insider risk investigations, just because it frames so much the user's activity. That identity data of like what business unit category are they in, what is their role, and what is the location. Location, yeah, I mean, can be useful for like improbable login stuff, potentially like unintentional insider or negligible insider when they get like popped and then they're logged in from externally and all that stuff. I think that's really helpful data to have, but category and role just to me frames things so much. And then location is a really, really nice to have, but I wouldn't say must have. And then ideal halves, I think, again, this sort of ties into the, system or IP to user. If you can just if you have somewhere a database of asset ownership, like this user owns this laptop and this, desktop, and this work phone, at least being able, because sometimes you won't have the IP, but you'll have the host name, and you're like, okay, best guess, 95% of the time is going to be that user. Like even if field services logs into their machine or whatever, like it's owned by this person. So it's nice to be able to surface or, make that connection between system and user. And then I think it's really, really cool because it's really great context is state information about that employee. So for example, and I've seen a lot of various tags. These are some of the more common ones I've seen out there. Depending on the company, they can do all sorts of interesting like tags about like why this user might be a little bit more high risk than other users. So for example, 2-week notice, a really, really good one. Temporary employee, contractor, and new hire. So like for new hire, for example, they might just like look at their HR database, look at the hire date, be like anyone within 6 months, just tag them as new hire, because they may not be doing it intentionally. It may just be that like negligent insider, but also maybe someone who's there specifically to get things out of your company. And then I think there's really cool stuff you can do with information about the type of access that they have. So these all kind of overlap in some degree, but sensitive business access could be like just access to files, whether that's like a tag of like, like you get this AD role, and then that gives you access to these Google Drives or network shares. And sort of related to that is like the IAM privileges that they have. So that user account, are there roles they have that like indicate some sort of level of special access? And then I separate out administrative accounts because sometimes the user doesn't have many IAM privileges, but they have an admin account, and that admin account has a lot of privileges. So being able to, again, tag that admin account to that user is really helpful, because then you can just look at the user, like no matter what they're doing, are they doing insider things across all contexts, all usernames, all systems, all IPs. So very cool stuff to have. So this next thing is one of my favorite things to talk about. It helped me so much as a customer. It was like the light bulb of, oh my gosh, why haven't I been doing detection this way for so long? And it's not, Splunk has it integrated into our process. You can do this with other tools sometimes. Sometimes it's a little too strict and doesn't allow you to sort of like build this type of aggregation, but it's all possible. You can do it. But the idea really is like traditional alerting. What we have is data source. We've got logic on that data, and out pops an alert on the other end. And the way we might try to like sort of indicate whether it's less bad or more bad is like criticality or severity. So it's like, oh, we've got criticals, highs, mediums, lows, informationals. Usually what that means, though, is like as security expands, we get more visibility, we have more detections, and every detection is generating alerts. Eventually, you get too many alerts, and it doesn't become feasible to respond to all of them. So it was like, well, we respond to highs and criticals, and mediums, lows, informationals. I don't know. They go in a bucket when an incident happens. We're like, oh, look at all those bad things that they did a while ago that we're just seeing. So not ideal. And so risk-based alerting is basically an aggregation strategy. So the idea is, rather than detection like data source and then out comes an alert, we're putting an intermediary step in there, which is a signal generation place. So we've got the data source, and instead of like logic that outputs an alert, we've got logic that outputs an observation. We're just observing that it happened. We're just being like, hey, this might be security relevant, but I'm not going to alert on it just yet. And when we make that observation, the idea is we tag it with like metadata. So on the top there, you see the 3 I have there of like risk score. So like a numerical score that indicates how bad this might be. Attack tactic, could just be like insider tactic. There's only a few relevant tactics in MITRE ATT&CK really for insider. And just the data source that it came from. Because we're bringing it to an abstraction layer, we do want to be like, hey, this came from EDR, this came from web, this came from firewall. And then on the bottom there, I think the really cool thing about score is because it's a number, you can really tweak this number by attributes about the entity that this event occurred on. So for example, if like this user put in their 2-week notice and the score is normally 10, maybe we double the score, maybe it's 20. Or if that user has admin privs and they're doing something, maybe because they have admin privs and they've got a 2-week notice, we bump it up a little bit more. And then we could also do interesting stuff about like the state of that user compared to its other users. And we could be like, well, for this business unit, they've never fired this signature before. We've never seen this detection happen on this business unit. So maybe it's a little extra that first time it's seen for that user, first time it's seen for that peer group, so on and so forth. So it's very, very cool. The idea is like now every entity in your environment, I think of it, it's like it's its own bucket. And now our detections are just filling the bucket with like a little bit of water or a lot of water, depending on, how severe this thing might be. But now we're only alerting when that bucket is overflowing with, security relevant insight. And the nice thing about this is, when we group all these events, so now we let you know what the bucket is full of, we've got like context, and a lot of times it just tells the story very straightforward. Like you can sort of see in sequence, like that looks bad, because I sort of see all these things right next to each other, and it tells the story automatically. It can often make investigation a lot easier to do. So to give an example of this, if we have this timeline of about 10 days, At the very beginning, again, these are all things we would want to know, but I could never alert on this in an enterprise environment. We can, with like 50,000 assets, I couldn't alert on this, but it's great signal. So if they send an email to a competitor's domain, a few points. Then they logged in at 8:30, a little weird for them. So abnormal hours, 25 points. These next two, if you notice, even though this timeline isn't like time accurate, you'll notice that the timestamp is within an hour, but they downloaded a high number of files, and then there was file activity to a USB device. So both of these alone, 25 points, so a total of 50. But you could also do an additional event like, hey, I saw these two detections together. Maybe that's just a direct alert because these two things, or it's just add more risk, whatever it is. But those two things chained together in sequence is really even more interesting than they are, individually. And then at the very end, they file their 2 weeks notice. And we count this as an event, even though this now becomes like, it could be an event as well as an attribute about the entity, that everything they do from this point forward will also be more risky. So it's like, it can contribute to both, which I think is really cool. And then the idea is I have a detection that just aggregates on the last 30 days or something like that. And then I generate an alert when the score for that entity exceeds 100 in a 30-day period. Obviously, it's going to be dealing with noise and like duplicates. You might have to do some deduplication and stuff to make that score relevant and sort of curate it to where it makes sense. But generally, I recommend like don't just keep moving the threshold. Set the threshold. Okay, 100's easy, or 500, whatever you want to do. But like now that you've set the threshold, curate around that score, because you want to think about like, well, should it be like 3 lows and a medium go over 100? Like 2 mediums goes over 100. A high and a low goes over 100. So you have to sort of think about scoring intentionally, but just don't just keep moving the threshold to try and make sense of the score. And then there's actually a method I generally recommend people go toward first rather than trying to get value out of scores, since that can be a little difficult, is just aggregating, say, by tactics. So what I mean is like, if I tagged my detections with these 4 things, collection, exfiltration, anomalous behaviors, and high-risk identity, I just had those 4 buckets for all of my detections across all my data sources. Then I could do like a vertical detection of, say, I say vertical because it's all from the same data source, of like, count the number of things that fired with the tactic of collection. And if the count is above 10, let me know, because they've just been doing a lot of things that are collection related. Or you could say, and this is a great deduplication tactic in many senses, especially when you have more detections, of let me know a distinct count of how many distinct detections fired, rather than like, because otherwise, one detection could fire 10 times or 11 times, and now you've got an alert. But now you're making it like, no, let me know when 3 distinct detections on that data source have fired. Might be a better way to like surface some initial value. But then as you build things out and you have more data sources, you can do the more horizontal approach of just like, okay, now like count across all my various tags and let me know when it's above 10. Or we could do the distinct count version of, I've got these 3 tags for my detections and one that's more like an attribute about the entity. So maybe I could do distinct tactic of collection, exfiltration, and anomalous. And when there's more than 5, say, distinct detections, maybe 3, then let me know. Or you could do something with the attribute, like the identity attribute, which is more about the entity and not about the detection necessarily. But the identity is a high-risk identity, and I'm setting the threshold lower for the distinct number of rules that need to fire for someone with a high-risk identity or admin privileges or 2-week notice, that sort of thing. So I could, normally have it at 5, but then if they have any of these high-risk entities, entity attributes, then maybe we lower the threshold to 2. Something like that. I think it's a lot easier to get value out of this type of thing first, because it's kind of just more simple. It aggregates a lot quicker. But score can be dynamically changed, which I think is really powerful when you get it working. So you can sort of build both and then start with this and see what works. And then as far as building content, I like I like, the detections having, some way of either indicating more risk score or just more context. So like, yeah, I want to know, this surprisingly isn't usually that noisy. Like, thousands of these events per day is not crazy. You can store that in an index. And then when you look at one user, they only sent like 3. But like, just knowing that they sent an external email, interesting signal, especially when you're investigating after like multiple things have aggregated together. But then I like making little tweaks on each one of these. So like, for example, external email with attachment, maybe a little more interesting because now there's an attachment to look at. Maybe external email to personal inbox is a subcategory of external email that is even more interesting in insider risk context. But then we could just even mash those together. So external email to personal inbox with attachment is even potentially even more interesting. So maybe you can craft this as one detection that has like separate titles or messages that indicates this to you. Maybe you have to make them separate detections. Regardless, I think the context is really interesting. But just thinking of additional subtypes of like, high count or large file size or just any detection. You can do this type of thing to get a little more distinguishing context for investigation later, because it also, having a higher score for some of these would also make sense as well. Some other examples, external email to competitor, again, external email to competitor with attachment, just sort of mixing and matching and seeing what makes sense to surface. And then I also want to make sure I mention the importance of size and count, because oftentimes you only have one or the other in the log source. But I think it's worth detecting both large data transfer, because that could be one archive file that is just, a bunch of other things, a high count of files collected in another context in like an archive. But when it's sent out as one file, you just want to know about the amount of the data. But depending on the data source, you might not have one or the other of these. But when you have both, you should know about both. They are both interesting things. And I just think it's worth, again, in that sort of distinguishing detections and making them distinct, making sure you do size and count are both interesting metrics in the sense of insider risk. So it's worth making detections around both. And then, I think, a lot of people want to get, ripping and roaring right away with like insider risk, doing all the fancy cool stuff out there. But as far as like anomaly detection stuff, I think is very, very cool. I think anomaly detection stuff by itself is difficult because you have no granular events. You're like, if you get, like, for example, if you get an like anomalous amount of files detected, it's like, well, in relation to what and to who and since when? All these questions that are a little bit harder to answer. But if you had it surrounded by granular like risk events of like, user collected a bunch of things in an archive, user sent something over the proxy to a file sharing site, like all these types of granular events, they inform that anomaly a lot easier than just an anomaly by itself. So I find, a lot of times when they have like a UEBA tool, it's sending them alerts, but they're difficult to investigate because they don't have the context around them. So I think it's very cool to do anomaly detection, but I would just start with like large data transfer. That's just good to know. You don't need to know in comparison to anything else. You just want to know that that happened. And then you can sort of build up to large data transfer compared to previous behavior, large data transfer compared to peer group. And if you have something like, I've got an example on, my RBA GitHub for Splunk, but like you can do this stuff with just simple statistics. Like it may, take up some performance and because you're looking at larger data sets and so on, but you can just sort of track this stuff with statistics because you just need to track at like, over time frame, like user normally in a week does this, and then just sum it up and have a sum. And then so for that user, you've got one column with like a month ago, over 7 days, they did this sum. And then 3 weeks ago, it was this sum, and then this sum, and then this sum. And you can compare the current value to the previous values and be like, oh, interesting, anomalous value. So if you have a UAV product, that's great. You bought it, you don't need to build it, but integrating it with everything else can be really, really handy. And then if you have DLP, I love when someone has DLP, but they're usually very, very noisy. They generate a lot of alerts, but risk-based alerting, the idea is to generate signal from noise. So that's great. We love noise because we get more signal. But what I often recommend people do is like turn the alert stream. They say the word alert, so you're thinking, oh, I got to respond. But no, 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 just turn it into a signal stream. Like just, all these various signals they have. And then on top of the signal stream, you can create additional signals, signal. So you can, on top of the signal stream, you can be like, this signature is almost never seen. It's a very rare signature. This signature is high severity. Just outright, we have a high count of this signature on this entity. Interesting. And then you can do the same sort of thing for like anomaly detection style stuff of like first time seen sig for user or peer group, rare signature for user or peer group, and anomalous activity compared to baseline for user or peer group. When they have DLP and it's like decently set up and tagged, it makes Insider a lot easier to do because they've got so much of the alerting stream and what's relevant to Insider risk sort of bubbling up to you. But oftentimes the way they present that data and those alert streams, not necessarily the easiest to navigate around or investigate. So I just recommend pulling it into this type of approach. And then as far as like DLP file types, I've sort of collated this from various like insider threat, like NIST guidances and so on and so forth. But if, DLP can be really powerful, but it does require a decent amount of tagging and like a strategy and an approach. But like there are different types of what's bad and what you might even be able to find about this. Like if you can't tag every single one of these, it's not the most important. If you're doing the stuff on endpoints and like network and all emails and all these other places, you will still find stuff. This is just really useful context to apply to the type of stuff that's being moved and transferred. So like if you can surface that, that's great, but not entirely necessary. And then if you're like, well, where do I get content ideas? Well, I was just introduced to this wonderful insiderthreatmatrix.org by Joshua Beeman of Security Blue Team. Motive on the left is more like, motive. It's like why they're doing what they're doing, which could be helpful to sort of like group behaviors together. But those next four are like, these are kind of like the MITRE attack for Insider. And I think it's great that he built this because MITRE attack, it has things that are secured, like insider relevant, but it's not all insider relevant, and it can kind of become confusing to mess with. So, and he's got even some ones in here that aren't on MITRE or even like a corollary to MITRE at all. So if you need ideas for detection content, take this and then take the ideas of like, high count, large size, detection distinctions of like distinguishing it in different ways based on what you have. You could build endless amounts of content here. I think it's really great. So lastly, to wrap up with the last piece of that picture I've been talking about is investigations. And this is actually one of my favorite parts. I used to be an animator, draw cartoons. A lot about animation is like strong silhouettes and like making things easy to read so people know what's happening. You want it to be very clear. And so I sort of dovetail into like front end UI UX stuff. I like not just good data. I like good data presented well, with the use, like presented in a way that it helps you do what you need to do. So you don't need to spend as many cognitive cycles understanding the data because the understanding is presented well. So investigations are one of my favorite things. But it is worth sort of knowing, again, we sort of mentioned this at the beginning, is like what is part of the investigation process now and what could be sort of related to like the data we could get at some point, but just thinking about, what are those steps? And then what are those steps we use? What is the insight that we're generating from it? Because if you frame it as like, what is the insight I'm trying to get at? It can be a lot easier to think about like which parts of that can be automated and which parts of that insight can I bring forward? Like rather than making the investigator go generate that insight themselves, think about like, okay, the insight they're trying to generate is this. How do we present that to them with the detection? Like it already comes with the detection, so they don't need to take manual steps to pursue that insight for themselves. You're just presenting it for them automatically. Can be really, really powerful. So I built a totally fake made up dashboard just to give an idea, but I've built dashboards very similarly that look similar to this, and seeing customers, take the ball and run with it and go absolutely wild. But the idea is I've got this dashboard. I put in this user, Donna Freight, at the top. I'm looking at the last 30 days. So right away, it pulls up those tags I was talking about. It's a high traffic department. So maybe that's actually like a tag that tweaks it down. Like, they always are making traffic. They're always firing detection. So that helps me know that like, okay, maybe this might not be the bad thing because they're generally doing things that look like bad. But I also see 2-week notice, contractor, and new hire. So maybe that balances that out. But I just have it presented all there. So it frames what I'm looking at. And further down the dashboard, I have a better idea of what might be relevant here. And then I pull up all their devices. Like when I look, I did that user to backwards system or IP translation. Here are all their devices. If I was going to make this a production dashboard, I would have all those clickable, and each one I could click in and get insight into just that device did. I could, make everything below the dashboard only show what that device did specifically. And then we've got the user information, like, oh, they're a brand specialist and creative. And here's their manager, just in case we want to, get in touch with them. We could find them in the company directory. And then, so that's like the top level insight. That's framing everything I'm going to do from there. And then I like thinking about the detections. So like, here are the detections that fired and how many times. So already I'm getting the story of like, okay, they sort of happened like this. Maybe I have a timeline, so it's a little more like clear about like this happened, then this happened. But just knowing what happened overall helps frame my investigation. And then I have like a sample over here of large upload to CloudShare. Like as if I clicked on that, I could get a little more detail about like, oh, they uploaded 3.6 gigabytes on this day and 1.2 gigabytes on this day, or something like that. But just making things clickable so the type, like, oh, I'd like to know a little bit more about that. Well, the insight can be surfaced easily. And then I really like these types of dashboards where you sort of make like download versus upload as like download as like a negative number. So just take the number of bytes that they transferred, just put a minus in front of it. So now when it shows on a graph, you've got this sort of like accounting balance of their download versus upload over time. Obviously, it will probably never look like that. Maybe I just used a random number generator to generate those values. But when you see that like high download and then high upload, that's a very interesting spike to look at, no matter what you're looking at. But also you might want just like number of files accessed on file shares. So ideally, you're just thinking about in every panel, like what is the insight from that data source that I could just bring forward automatically. So I am not forcing the investigator to go like, well, what did they do here and run a manual query? And then what did they do here and run a manual query? If we can surface a lot of this to them, they can make decisions a lot quicker about what might be bad or not. So generally my principles when I'm designing a dashboard is like generating insight in order, in the sense of like, knowing the user frames the detections, knowing the detections frames what I'm looking at that they're doing in each data source. So thinking that sort of like top-down approach of like what would make sense to show first can be really helpful. And then, also being able to like click further into things, like maybe they don't need to know this right away, but if they click on it, they get to know this or something like that, that gives them this like expandable insight approach. And then just automating what you would normally be investigating, make it a panel, make that insight accessible. And, if they need to look at raw data, sure, you want to have process to look at that as well, especially to confirm when someone is maybe an insider and legal needs to get involved. But ideally, you just want to sort of bring that insight forward and automate it. And I would just say that users are the best feedback. Like you could build the best thing, but if the user doesn't understand what you've built and doesn't understand that you could click on this to get this insight, like all of this is really good information. And often, users will be the best knowers of what they are encountering friction wise. And that friction is good stuff. That's what you want to build better. So I think, staying in touch with users while you build things and after you've built things can be really powerful to get like additional, efficiency gains, less time to investigate, yada, yada, yada. For general ideas, I'm just taking like, these are the data sources we talked about. Like, sure, a timeline would be nice to see the detections on a timeline. But then the upload download in cloud, upload download network proxy, DLP activity could just be counts, could just be, high severity findings. Are they doing any archiving? Like how many files did they archive at once? USB write activity and emails sent externally by type with those types I mentioned of like with attachment to personal, yada, yada. I think these are all it's just a place to get you started, but I think people can build all sorts of cool stuff. So to recap, we were talking about, asking a lot of questions, generating some answers. So for data, we thought about like, can I access the data? Who has the data? And really importantly, can I attribute the user? And then what am I building? What is the end result? When the investigator is investigating, what am I doing with the data at the beginning? And then detections, do I have identity data? Because again, so important. Can I enrich with state data? Because I think it's really useful to have. Can I generate and aggregate signal? Basically something RBA-ish. As long as you can create alerts into a source, you don't necessarily need to investigate in that source. Maybe you could pull that source and make that your, like aggregation stream where you look there. And then what detections can I make, should I make, so on and so forth. And lastly, with investigations, what can be automated? Can I surface that insight really quickly? And how do I integrate that feedback? And then with all of this in purview, just thinking about, 20% of effort. Think about phase one for each piece of this. Like just get phase one done. It doesn't need to be perfect to get started and start getting value very quickly. Oftentimes when people start doing that, like RBA aggregation of like, multiple signatures from one source, or immediately you're finding like, oh, there's a lot of weird stuff going on in here. So just switching the context and moving your effort where it makes sense, I think can be really, really valuable. So that's all I've got for today. So I saw a bunch of good questions. I was trying not to get sidetracked, but I'm happy to start digging into the questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Haley. There were a few. AJ said early on when you made a comment about making friends strategy, they couldn't agree more. I have found this to contribute to lasting strategic relationships in previous roles, lasting even after I've left the role. Question, do you have any
Yeah, absolutely.
strategies that you would recommend for making friends with HR or legal folks in hybrid workforces where all the parties sit in different locations and are generally more siloed? I found
Yeah.
success with strategy when I could take the business partner out to lunch or stop by their desk, but having the face-to-face helps, but how do you do it
Yeah. I mean,
otherwise?
I'm fully remote now. Oftentimes when I'm like working with a new team for the first time, I'll just, like 15-minute calendar invite, just sort of chat, not even about work, just sort of get on the same page of like, who is this person? Here's my history, background. I think, that's one way of doing it. But yeah, it's just being really intentional about like engagement. And I think, the email with a direct ask is a little bit different from like, hey, could we get on a call and like proposing like, oh, we were thinking about this data, but also we have visibility. What, you can frame all of that like in a friendly way rather than just like with an email where it just feels like, even if you say like, hey, how can we help? They may just see the ask. Versus like in person, so to speak, across a camera, you could just start that friendship a lot easier, I think.
Hmm. Hope that was helpful. Moving on, Seth said he was wondering if you have any suggestions on preventing score runaway or rescoring based on volume criticality. They're building a RBA solution,
Mm.
and I'm finding that we're consistently having to raise the threshold, and I'm worried we're missing potential combinations that would be worrying to us.
Yeah, I think that's a common thing to happen. I've got some stuff in the tank that's going to be in ES well soonish that will help with that sort of like deduplication. But ultimately, I think because you're just generating signal, ultimately the place to do deduplication is in the aggregate alert, like the thing that's looking at all the events gathered together. You can often just like, I only want this source, like this detection source, like let's say it has a score of 10, but it fired 10 times, so now it's a score of 100. You could just say, and this is on the RBA GitHub. If you want to dig into it, feel free to reach out to me, yada yada. But it's out there. It's just like a capped risk score. Like each source can only contribute its highest score twice. So like if its score is 10, the max score it contribute is 20, something like that. Then there's also the issue of like, I'm alerting on, I'm aggregating risk on the system and the user. So now I get an alert for the system and the user. So you kind of have to have a way of indicating, okay, like if if I'm getting these same events, like clearly it's the same thing, just alert on the entity with the most number, because I will be able to see all the other detections that were just to the user or just to the system. But if they're both firing the same detections, you need some way of deduplicating there. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me about that. I can talk all day and I've got examples.
Yeah, and you can drop your email in the chat
Yeah.
if you don't mind. Awesome. Himanshi asks, how do you determine and build in a false positive threshold? We're running into that just based on how logs are parsed from different systems, especially on network data.
I'm trying to, Himanshi, if you could give me a little more detail about like what you mean by false positive threshold. Is that something that you're like
Yeah.
determining per detection or?
Yep. So, and you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. So, what I mean false positives, so we have something like this built in within, we created a separate app for insider risk, which is bringing in data from ES into insider risk. But what I'm running into, so for example, say for example, we're looking at the geolocation alerts, right? It was an example that you mentioned early on. And what the way that our network is set up, we have some things going through VPN, other things going through a split tunnel where that is coming from our web proxy. And so it's false positives like that, where it's not necessarily the inside or not necessarily the employee being an insider, it's just the way that the logs are being parsed between the split tunneling web proxy and then the VPN and then maybe their actual home IP address. And so, it's showing up on our dashboards as, hey, this is a false positive, or this is a, insider risk alert, but in reality, it's just a false positive just because of the way that the network's parsed within our systems. So any thoughts or recommendations? If not, I can also shoot over an email, and we can work
Yeah,
through
I
that.
would love an email with a little more detail, because I'm thinking of a few approaches. That is a tricky one, because like
Mm-hmm.
there are things like obviously you could pump the score down, but if it's like a really high value detection, you don't necessarily want to do that. But also
Exactly.
because you're on the sort of aggregation end, and it sounds like you might be able to do some distinguishing. Like once it surfaces, you're like, oh, that's the false positive one. So
Mm-hmm.
building in logic either to the aggregate alert or to the dashboard that does some of that, like, eval is a Swiss Army knife of like, check inside here. And if it checks this and that turns out this way, then mark it as false positive, bump the score down to 0. I think that's the way to do it. If you can determine when the alert shows up that like, oh, this
Exactly.
is actually the false positive, you can logic that to
Okay.
determine that automatically. And that's that sort of like, that's that insight you do want to automate in the investigation
Mm-hmm.
end, because you're solving that like, oh, now I'm noticing, now that it's here, that it's this type of thing. We could either work some of that insight into the detection so the aggregate isn't miscounting those, but then also in the investigation we could do that as well.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and then Stuart asked why not demo UBA. I mean, I think I wanted to provide as much value as possible to literally anyone using literally any product. I didn't want to come in here and be like, the way to do this is with Splunk, and that's the only way you're going to solve all your problems. Because that's generally just how I approach things. I think problems are thematic. They're not necessarily, like one thing does everything perfectly. So that's part of the reason I sort of drove the approach here. As far as UBA, I mean, I think it sort of falls under that thing I was talking about of like, you can have a UEBA solution and it tells you like, hey, here's anomalies. But that's kind of difficult to investigate without that type of granular context that tells more of a story, tells more about the user's actual behavior and not just their anomalous behavior. So I just think that is generally more valuable to talk about because, I didn't want to just come in here and say, buy Splunk and your problems will be solved. Because, every solution you have is going to be like integrated into operations and process. And that's more important, I think, ultimately, for getting value out of things. Looks like we have 4 more minutes. If anyone has any more questions.
Yeah, I think there's one by David. Is there a need to separate insider threat events or risk scores from the core cybersecurity events risk scores so that scores can be looked at separately or together?
Yeah, no, that's a really good one, David. I don't know if it's a need per se, but I think it is valuable to do because, malicious compromise goes everywhere, as I said, and insider risk can be sort of scoped. What we did, it's relatively simple, at least in Splunk, is just sort of like at the end of the search, just eval like insider underscore relevant equals 1. And so in our insider risk detections, we're like insider relevant equals 1. For the aggregate where it like finds all the events, it's like it's only looking at insider relevant ones because oftentimes they're going to the same place ultimately, but you do want to distinguish them. So it's kind of like applying a tag to the signal. And I think that's just an easy way of doing it. And then the nice thing is if you're doing something RBA-ish in other contexts that aren't insider risk, then you could also here's the insider risk investigation dashboard, but like if you really wanted to know, you could dig into all the risk they're generating in every other context, because sometimes it might be relevant and you find stuff in there that you're like, oh, this is actually insider relevant, let's go apply that tag to that detection because maybe it would be useful to have here. And yeah, I don't know who I need to give the slides to, but I've got the slides.
Yeah, we'll figure out a way.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to share.
Yeah, Haley, if you want to send those over to Krista, that would be great. She can get them disseminated.
Okay, perfect. All right, well,